Exorcist is widely regarded as not just one of the best horror films of all time, but one of the best films, period. The sequels, not so much. But which one is the worst? Which one's actually pretty good? Here's my ranking of all 6 Exorcist films, from one of the worst movies of all time to one of the best movies of all time. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies and TV way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of all 6 Exorcist films. My list isn't the right list, it's just my list, and I would love to see yours. One more thing before we get started, this video is brought to you by Audible. I'm a big fan of Audible because I like to read with my ears, not my eyes, so I have been a subscriber ever since 2015, and actually in preparation for the new Exorcist film coming out, I checked out the book, The Exorcist Legacy. It's a behind-the-scenes book on the whole franchise, going back to the writing of the original novel and then the production of each film, the TV show, and even interviews about the new film that hasn't even come out yet. And I listened to it on Audible. If you're a big fan of the Exorcist franchise, want to do a deep dive, I do recommend checking out that book, and you can listen to it for free at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. Also, The Exorcist is based off of a book, which you can also listen to on Audible at audibletrial.com/Sean Chandler. You can get a free audiobook of your choice as well as a free 30-day trial of Audible at that link. The information is down below in the description. With that said, let's get started. In last place, The Exorcist II, The Heretic. As much as the original film is widely regarded as one of the best films of all time, this is widely regarded as one of the worst sequels and films of all time. There's simply no excuse for how poorly conceived and executed this film is. The basic premise here involves reframing of the entire film, The Exorcist, where there are now superpowered people in the world, including Regan, and because of that, the devil sends Pazuzu to stop them, because great goodness attracts great evil. And somewhere in the mix, we get a bunch of locusts, and we got sci-fi equipment that links people's brains together. All of this is a sequel to The Exorcist.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
There's literally a sequence in this movie where our lead character cures someone of autism by speaking to her. And this entire idea seems to violate what made the original film so terrifying. That she was totally normal. That this could happen to anyone. Anyone could be a pawn in this game of good and evil. And now it's the superpowered people are really what the problem is. Now, on paper, the idea of hiring John Boorman to do a sequel superficially looks great, because this is a guy that just a few years earlier made the Oscar-nominated film Deliverance. But this is a director that turned down directing The Exorcist and said he didn't want to direct it and he didn't want anyone else to direct it because he thought it was a film that could be damaging. And in fact, one of the reasons he signed on to do the sequel was because he thought through making the second film, he could fix the damage done by the first movie. It's inherently at odds with the original film, as well as the audience of the original film. It's actively trying to reshape what people loved about the original one and not trying to deliver what people wanted or expected from an Exorcist film. The original author has trashed the film. William Friedkin has gone off on it many, many different times.
So I went in the screening room and I see some guys riding on the back of a bumblebee or some fucking thing. It was unreal. And I left.
And in The Exorcist Legacy, they have a whole bunch of quotes from people in The Exorcist II where they basically said, we signed on for one movie and it seemed really good, and then it went through countless rewrites. So the movie that was made is not at all what we signed up for. Now, there is one kind of interesting detail about The Exorcist II. It has one big gigantic fan, Martin Scorsese. He said, the picture asked, does great goodness bring upon itself great evil? This goes back to the book of Job. It's God testing the good. In this sense, Regan is a modern day saint, like Ingrid Bergman in Europa 51, and in a way like Charlie in Mean Streets. I like the first Exorcist because of the Catholic guilt I have, and because it scared the hell out of me. But The Heretic surpasses it. Maybe Borman failed to execute the material, but the movie still deserved better than it got. In 5th place, Exorcist The Believer. And this is a movie I went into extremely skeptical because I didn't think David Gordon Green was the right person to bring back The Exorcist.
I got a bad feeling about this.
As much as I thoroughly enjoyed Halloween 2018, the set of skills that it takes to bring back Halloween is not the same set of skills that it takes to bring back The Exorcist. They're very different franchises, and the idea of like doing a legacy sequel and we'll bring back the final girl, that's awesome for Halloween, doesn't make a lot of sense with The Exorcist. The trailers only kind of raised my suspicions that something was going to be off here, and then I watched the movie, and honestly, it was worse than I was expecting because it both seemed like it missed the magic of what made the original so terrifying, but also just made so many silly choices that not only I don't think made for a bad film, but put a really bad taste in my mouth at that. So the first part of the film felt like a generic missing child story. We've seen this movie before about kids going missing, everyone trying to find them. And then in the middle, it starts to explain what happened, and it turns into kind of a generic movie about a person who lost a loved one, and therefore they turn to the occult, and it unleashes an evil upon them, which we've seen many times before. And then they bring in a legacy character in what feels like a cheap cameo, but also they use a legacy character to undermine the original film. Like, I simply can't believe that there's a line of dialogue in this movie where they have Chris say that the reason she wasn't allowed into her child's exorcism is because of the patriarchy. That's a line in this movie. Like, she throws the 2 men that died to save her child under the bus because of the patriarchy. They didn't let her in because it was dangerous. They literally died because of it. And when there's choices like that being made in a movie, you know something has gone horribly wrong. And then from there, you move into the 3rd act where it just comes up with this goofy finale where they essentially do the Exorcism Avengers, where it's like they weren't able to allow the Roman Catholic Church to just be the heroes. So all of a sudden the Roman Catholic Church turns them down, the priest is a wimp, and everyone else teams up with the power of unity or something like that to perform an exorcism, which once again undermines the lore that's been established. Even the note that it ends on with the death that takes place was just done in a way that once again was just distasteful. This is a franchise that dwells in the dark and has all sorts of jacked up things happening. But there's also this sense of good triumphing over evil that's absent from this film. It's at least like competently made. It's slick in the production. There's some moments that kind of worked. Beyond that, I think this was a total misfire and showed David Gordon Green does not understand the original Exorcist.
It stinks.
Next up, Exorcist The Beginning. Now, honestly, I love all of these bizarre moments in Hollywood history where there's a movie with so much turmoil behind the scenes that we end up with 2 totally different versions of the exact same film. And in the case of the Exorcist prequel, I think the behind the scenes drama in that story is more interesting than either versions of the film that came out. But I'm fascinated when we're able to see 2 wildly different versions of a film. And in the case of this one, the Rennie Harlan version, the one that was mass released, I think utterly misses what made the original interesting and powerful in the first place. There's just way too much going on, too many backstories, too many competing organizations, too much on the nose, just in your face gore for the sake of shock value. And there's big action set pieces that you're like, what on earth is this doing in the middle of an Exorcist film? And all of that goes back to producers that didn't get it. So I'll talk about this a little bit more on the next one, but this is essentially reworking of a movie from Paul Schrader. Originally, this movie was going to be made by the guy that wrote Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and The Last Temptation of Christ. And when they didn't like that version, they wanted a version that had more kind of shocks, gore, scarier, bigger, bolder. So they brought in the director of A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, Cliffhanger, and more recently, Deep Blue Sea.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for them.
These guys are not compatible. I like each of their work quite a bit, but Rennie Harlin and what he's great at has nothing to do with what Paul Schrader is great at, and it has nothing to do with what the Exorcist franchise is all about. And so you get this movie that superficially is more entertaining than Paul Schrader's version of the film because it has action, because it moves faster, the camera's moving and all that stuff. But it's all schlocky and cheap entertainment value that feels like it's just cheapening the franchise as a whole. It doesn't offend me the way that the Exorcist the Believer did in just violating the lore, but it does not deserve to be a part of this franchise. In third place, Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. This is the original version of The Exorcist prequel, but the second one to be released. And I still find this to be slow. It is inherently flawed in its structure, but I think it's better because it actually feels like an artist tackling subject matter. As mentioned before, it's from Paul Schrader, the guy that wrote Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and Last Temptation of Christ. He's someone that had a very religious upbringing, and while not a Catholic upbringing, it was a Calvinistic, Protestant upbringing. Those ideas about belief and religion very much saturate his work. So on paper, he seems like a great pick if you're going to do a prequel to The Exorcist about Father Merrin. And there's a number of ideas in here that I think are quite powerful. Even just kind of the inciting incident about what happens to Merrin during World War II, that he does have this crisis of faith. There's some interesting subversive ideas about how the possession takes place, what it does to this community. As the guy gets healthier, the community gets wilder and crazier, and they start to lose their mind. That's interesting, but I think it also is inherently flawed in when you're trying to watch the movie and want to have a certain progression of evil, and it doesn't work quite right. And I think just in general, it's a movie that lacks oomph. It's trying to tackle these ideas of lost faith, but it doesn't have anything that profound to actually say. It wants to have the layers, but it never quite finds it. And then it doesn't have anything that kind of pops about it. And just several kind of choices in the execution just make for a movie that's rather dull and lifeless. I have it above the Rennie Harlin version because I think that this fits the franchise better. I think it has more to say. I still don't think it really works, though. Real quick before I give you my top two, remember to join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of the Exorcist franchise. My list isn't the right list. It's just my list, and I'd love to see yours. Also, if you're new here, I've done a ton of these horror rankings in the past. Conjuring, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Child's Play, and so many more. You can check them out right up here in this playlist when this video is over. Our runner-up, The Exorcist III. To be perfectly clear, there's a big gap between the bottom four and The Exorcist III because I think this is a solid follow-up to The Exorcist, and the big reason for that is that it's from William Peter Blatty. That is the author of the original novel, The Exorcist, and then he wrote a follow-up novel to it, which this is an adaptation of his book, but he also wrote the screenplay as well as directed the film. So this is the true follow-up in the mind of the originator of The Exorcist, though there was some compromise because of studio interference. And what makes it interesting is that it's in no ways a rehash of The Exorcist. It is a wildly different spin on the mythology. In fact, it's a supernatural detective story following off a deleted scene from the original Exorcist and kind of follows us down kind of this path and tells a very different type of story in this same supernatural world and realm. One of the things about it that just stands out to me every time I rewatch it is the friendship between the priest and the detective that was from this scene that was originally deleted from The Exorcist and was reinstated in many of the versions that have been released over the decades. But this friendship forms between these two characters, and it's just such a natural relationship. They feel like two They feel like two old friends that have been bantering and going to the movies together for a very long time. You believe that he deeply cares about this person. And I'd say almost for that reason, I liked the first half of the movie more than the second half because I just so bought into that relationship that when it was gone, it felt like the back half was missing something really special. And also the back half is where the studio interference started to really come into play. I haven't seen the director's cut of the film yet. I've only seen the theatrical cut, but they kind of insisted on adding an exorcism into the mix. And then originally Brad Dourif entirely played this character in the film. And then in the reshoots, they got the original actor back. So then in the theatrical cut, it's cutting between these two people in a fashion that's a little bit confusing as to exactly what's going on there. But still, it's a solid continuation of this world with some great performances, great moments. The exorcism that they added in has some images in there that absolutely stick in your brain as the guy sticks to the wall and tries to get away from it. And it has like its own profound moments in its own way. I don't think it nearly reaches the heights of the original one that was just such a groundbreaking, potent film, but it is a solid continuation that brings something new to the table. But in first place, the original, The Exorcist, and 50 years later, this is still the bar by which every other possession film is measured. 50 years later, it's still one of the ballsiest and most shocking possession films ever put out in mainstream cinema. And so much of that is because it is this effective slow burn as you watch this very normal girl be taken over, and the moments of normal life make the moments of vulgarity all the more shocking. And to this day, 50 years later, there's still images in this film, things that she does that just are like, wow, I can't believe they put that in a movie. And as much as we have graphic violence and all sorts of crazy things happen, she still says and does things that you don't see in movies like this that makes it all the more incredible that they did this 50 years ago. And when you think about this, is the movie that essentially invented this whole subgenre of films, and audiences had never seen a movie like this before. They'd never seen those types of behaviors, a child saying and doing those kinds of things. And when they made the film, they recruited William Friedkin, who his previous movie won Best Picture and him Best Director. Just keep that in mind. That's the caliber of talent that was drawn to this project 50 years ago. And you think kind of the types of horror movies that are kind of made today, and the type of talent that is normally drawn to them, you don't have a lot of occasions where someone wins Best Picture, Best Director, and they say, hey, let me do the shocking horror film. But that's what happened in 1973, and that's why this movie is just of a different caliber than its sequels and so many other films in the genre. It was treated as a prestige film about characters with layers and depth. Superficially, it's about this trying to save this girl. Beneath that, it's about a priest and his faith. It's about what would it take for you to believe, or for you to believe again. And it explores this while entertaining with the shocking images and the gore and the spinning heads and the vomit and things like that. But it was told by a master craftsman. That's why it stood the test of time. That's why it's still shocking to this day. Probably slower paced than we're used to in modern era. Besides that, it absolutely holds up. There's a reason that this is hailed as one of the greatest horror films of all time and one of the greatest films of all time. It's a classic, so it comes in at number 1. If you enjoyed this video, remember I've got more horror rankings just like this right over there. Likewise, if you want to check out the book The Exorcist Legacy or some of the original Exorcist novels, the link for that free trial of Audible is down below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV too much.